As I noted earlier, the number of ways to customize charts can be simply mind-boggling. However, there are some frequently used features that we can cover in a reasonably short time frame that will not only give you some specific examples of the customization options, but they should also help you better understand how the options are organized. Let's start with some of our series options. In particular, I'm going to use one of the filled radar charts that I showed you a few lessons ago. Each of these series is overlapping one another, which results in some of the data being obscured behind other data points. This would be a nice place for our graphs to be transparent so that we could see how they overlap. To do this, let's select one of the series. The topmost one is series Jessica. I can select the series by clicking on it so it's highlighted, right-clicking, and then choosing Format Data Series. This opens the format bar along the right side of my screen. There are 3 general categories for the radar data series. From left to right, they are the paint bucket for fill and line, the pentagon for effects, and the column chart for series options. To make our data transparent, we'll want to go to the fill and line section where our border and fill properties can be modified. As you can see, this subset has many different options. Along the top are the line and marker options. The line section manipulates the border of our shapes. For now, we're going to leave this as automatic, and we're going to move into the marker settings. Under the marker settings, there are marker options, fill options, and border options. The marker options control whether to show a marker at each vertex and what shape and size the marker should be. The border settings actually modify the border around the exterior of the markers themselves. In this way, you could make an orange circle with a black border for each vertex if you wanted to. The settings that we're interested in right now are in the fill settings. Within the fill settings, you can see that it's currently set to automatic. We're going to change that to solid fill, and we're going to see a new option show up, the transparency option. I'll reselect an orange color, as doing this has changed the fill color, and then I can select my transparency slider and drag it to see my chart become more transparent for that data series. For this chart, I tend to like transparency around 50%, so that's what I'm going to select here. The first thing you're likely to notice is that I've only made this modification to the single series for Jessica. Each series is customized independently so that you can be as detailed as you want to be. However, the cost for that comes in the form of a very time-consuming process for more complex charts. This chart has only 4 series, yet making all of them transparent still takes quite a bit of time, as you can see. Now, let's move on to another valuable modification, axis manipulation. For this problem, we're going to go look at our baseball data yet again. We created a bar chart for this data in the very first lesson when I introduced chart objects. Here, you could see a slightly adjusted form of that chart where I have no title and the data point values are at the end of each bar. You might look at this chart and think that it doesn't make much sense to plot plate appearances against team wins since they are such vastly different number types. One averages over 500, while the other averages around 70. You'd be right in making that evaluation. Wouldn't it be useful to see them plotted independently of each other within the same chart? So to our series options we go. Since the plate appearances data is longer, I'll click on it, since it's easier to click, and I'll modify it by right-clicking and choosing Format Data Series. For this adjustment, we're going to look at our series options. This is one area where 2D charts have a significant advantage over the 3D visuals. 3D bar charts will not have an alternative axis option, but here I can set the plate appearances to map to a secondary axis. The result is that I have an axis along the bottom that corresponds to team wins only, and an axis along the top that corresponds to plate appearances only. The benefit for this is twofold. First, I can see in more detail how the team wins changes respective of plate appearances. Secondly, I have even more detailed control over my data view than before. I've quickly made my data transparent to make the bars easier to read. Now, axis manipulation only begins with the ability to segregate data across different axes. Note that our plate appearances are universally greater than 400. What if I wanted my axis to start at 400 instead of 0, so that I would have more detail? Well, I can manually manipulate my axis bounds by selecting the axis I'm interested in this case the plate appearances axis across the top, looking at my format axis options, and under the axis options themselves, I can modify the bounds of my axis. There are a bunch of different modifications I can make, from adjusting the minor and major grid lines to where our axis crosses and some other values. For this adjustment, I want to change my minimum position value from 0, which is the automatic setting, to 400. When I do this, my maximum ends up getting automatically adjusted as well to better reflect the data within the chart. And I can always reset my minimum bound by pressing the reset button that appears. By setting the minimum to 400, I can see how the different points on the chart better compare. For example, 1994, this player had less than 400 plate appearances, and so the bar does not appear at all, instead of appearing as a fairly long-looking line. This exaggerates the differences between these plate appearances by setting a minimum bound. I can do this same thing to the team's wins axis and set the minimum to 60. Doing so vastly rescales the total wins bar to make the wins at 95 and 91 seem significant, while the other years look less so. For some of our data sets, we can do the same thing to the y-axis to effectively zoom in on certain data segments, such as for scatter plots or line plots. But for now, let's move on to our next section and look at some better ways to label and identify important pieces of data. The whole point of charts is to visualize data, and frequently, charts will have an interesting data point that a user might want to see the specific value for. None of my charts are particularly well designed for this since they're implicitly simple data. However, let's create an example on one of our line charts anyways. On this simple line chart, where I've showed the revenues from each segment, we might have particular interest in the revenue for unit zeta at time 4, and the revenue for unit alpha at time 1. Where we've customized entire data series up to this point, we can also customize individual data points. This is quite a bit more challenging as the individual data point needs to be selected, and for really large and dense data sets, you might have difficulty selecting the point you want without first modifying the axis to zoom in. With that in mind, I'm going to do just that. I'm going to set the maximum for my y-axis equal to 100 and the minimum to 50, since that is where the point I'm interested appears to lie. Then I'll select the series and click specifically on the point that I'm interested in, and note that my customization panel changes from data series to data point to indicate that I have just a single item selected. I can then go to my fill in line settings, select marker, and under marker options, I can turn the marker on, select a shape that I'm interested in. I'm going to use a triangle, and set its size to make it visually jump out at the user. This makes my data point jump out at the user, but I'm still missing something. So I want to right-click on my point, and I want to choose Add Data Label. The data label itself can be moved around the graph, and when moved, it includes a little line that will point back to the marker. The label itself is just text that can be edited by double-clicking on it. So I can add flavor text like New Management. Changes to the underlying data will flow through into the label, so I can modify the raw data to be anything and have it automatically update. I like to use these labels to draw attention to outliers and include possible reasons or even notes to ask about what happened there. With this, I'm going to conclude this lesson on chart customization. As you've seen, there are dozens of other settings across many different chart components that can be tweaked and modified to create the chart you want or need. In our next lesson, we'll look at how to create mixed charts using different chart types in a single chart.